So we will kick off on introductions whilst we're waiting for Natasha to join. I'll start. My name is Carrie-Anne Lightly. I am Head of Marketing at AccessAble. I use a wheelchair and I have cerebral palsy. So I have my own lived experience related to this session, and I will bring that out as we go along. And now I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So we will start with Callum. Callum, please introduce yourself with your name, your lived experience related to today's session, and the work that you do.
Thank you very much. My name is Callum Russell and I'm blind since birth. I am the founder of a bespoke consultancy called Crystallize, which supports organisations on any aspect of disability inclusion, but with a particular focus on those with disabilities. And I suppose I have bring lots of lived experience of having to access services and information from the perspective of somebody who has a vision impairment.
Thank you, Callum. It's really great to have you with us today and to have that unique perspective that we can bring out when we look at the importance of information, of the welcome received, and of the accessibility of the space. So now I would like to ask Charlie. Charlie, please introduce yourself, again, using your name, your lived experience related to the session, and the work that you do.
Yeah, so my name's Charlie Randall. I also have cerebral palsy, which means I'm pretty much a full-time wheelchair user. So I use a wheelchair to get around on a daily basis. And in regards to what I do in the disability space, I'm a disability content creator on social media using several platforms to promote living as a young disabled male and the opportunities that are out there for us and what we can achieve. I also do some disability consultancy on the side as well to help businesses and people become more aware of how they can support disabled people.
Thank you, Charlie. Again, great to have you here today. And I think, you know, we can see just within the introductions from Callum and Charlie that we've got a really good subset of sort of diversity between the both of them. They've both got very different needs in terms of accessibility and very different backgrounds in terms of the work that they do. So I'm really excited to learn more about each person's experiences as we go along. So we are still waiting for Natasha to join. Unfortunately, she has been tied up. So we will do an introduction with Natasha once she's able to join us. For now, I would like to give you a little bit of background into today's session, the reasoning behind the session today, and the reasoning why it's really so important to look at providing the best possible experience for disabled people. So I have put some statistics here on this slide that really just show why it's so important to manage expectations, to manage staff training and disability equality, and to make improvements to the physical space. So we know at AccessAble from our own research that 77% of disabled people have left places where accessibility was not what they expected. And some of the reasonings for that. So 45% said that the staff had poor attitudes. 47% said that when they arrived, the facilities that they were told to expect weren't there. And 70% said that the facilities they were told were there weren't working or were not available when they arrived. So again, really important to consider what we call the 3 facets of accessibility: information, welcome, and space. And we find that, managing expectations is so important in that information piece. So looking at the pre-arrival information, I want to know as a disabled person what facilities you can provide for me before I come to your venue. I want to make sure that I can feel confident in what to expect. I also want to be able to engage with staff who have confidence in welcoming disabled customers and disabled people. And, lastly, I want to be able to get the most and the best out of the physical space. So I want to know that that space is going to be accessible for me, as I said, in that pre-arrival information. But I also want to see in the space that improvements have been made, that it's been made to be as accessible as it possibly can for me. Now, I'm going to ask, have we got Natasha now online? Are we still waiting? I think we're still waiting. Okay, no problem.
Hello. Hi.
Oh,
Yeah.
hi, Natasha.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for jumping in there. So, Natasha, I'm just going to recap on what we said in the beginning, which is that all panelists should mute their microphones when they're not speaking, and that all panelists should raise their hands when they are ready to ask a question. So can you please introduce yourself today, Natasha, letting everybody know your name, your lived experience related to today's session, and the work that you do. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Natasha Littman. I'm a journalist. I live with a number of what we would call invisible disabilities or chronic illnesses. So I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So I have a lot of chronic pain, chronic fatigue. And I am an ambulatory wheelchair user. So sometimes I use a wheelchair, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I use crutches, sometimes I have a rollator. So I have the experience of kind of presenting very differently depending on the day and how my conditions are affecting me. I worked for the BBC as a journalist specialising in chronic illness for 4 years, and now I write and podcast on Substack, and I consult with a lot of medical professionals and startups in the chronic illness and pain space. Is that enough, Karen?
Excellent, thank
Great,
you
thank
so much. So just, recapping on something that I said earlier after we had Callum and Charlie's introductions, is that, we've got a real set of diversity within our panelists today, within, what each person's access needs and requirements are, and what each person's experiences are or have been. So I think we will jump straight in to our panel session, where you will now learn more about each panelist's lived experience of disability. So, sorry, technical problem with the microphone there. Our first set of questions here focus on assumptions. Assumptions around disability, realities of living with disability, and then also language. So the language that individuals are comfortable using and that they're more comfortable with other people using to describe disability. So which one of our panelists would like to answer our first set of questions? Can I have a raised hand from anybody there? Okay, so I'm going to go with Charlie first. So Charlie, can you please tell us what assumptions you feel people make when it comes to your disability or condition, what the realities of living and working with your disability or condition are, and what language you're most comfortable using, and the language that you're most comfortable for others to use when speaking about disabilities. Thank you.
Yep. So often the assumptions that I get, first of all, let me apologise. I'm in my office and it just happens to be where the water pump is. So if you can hear that in the background, I do apologise. But to answer the first question, what are the assumptions that people make about my disability? One of the common ones is that I am non-verbal. Many of my friends will tell you this is in fact very truly wrong. I talk far too much, and also that often I find that people will talk to the individual that's with me rather than me as the individual that has the disability. So, for example, they'll ask my friend, does he want to drink? They won't go, do you want to drink? So that's something that I often experience because I'm often at a lower level, sitting in a wheelchair. People often talk to the person who's tall, higher or taller than me. And that's an often experience that's really difficult for me to negotiate because obviously I want to be able to speak for myself as an individual. Another thing I often get being a young disabled individual is, oh, but you won't want to do that. You won't want to access this bar or this nightclub or this specific venue because you're not your average young person. Why would a young person with a disability want to experience anything that's any different? Is another common misconception that particularly my brand tries to tackle on a daily basis. The realities of my how my disability affects me in terms of accessing an environment, whether that be a medical environment, accessing a bar, restaurant, job opportunities, anything like that. I consider myself quite fortunate because I don't actually require too much. For me personally, it's that I have level access, a parking space available if I've driven there, or an accessible station so that I can travel to said locations, and also making sure that there's an accessible toilet and there's no real big hills or anything for me to worry about. But that's all comes down to the preparation that I have to do as a disabled individual, which I think we're probably going to discuss quite regularly during this webinar, of the preparations that you have to make and the anxieties that come with that, and having to know all of the information in the palm of your hand, which AccessAble actually allows us to fully tackle. In terms of what language I prefer, I go with a, which some people don't agree with, I go with a very happy-go-lucky reaction to this, in terms of I'm very open to people using different languages, providing it's not outright offensive. Now, what that means obviously depends on the individual, but my view is the terminology you use to describe my disability or my condition is the terminology that you've been exposed to. So I take the approach of, we can have that conversation of, oh, okay, that terminology isn't great, but I would use this one, but it's not necessarily one that I don't have a blanket statement where I can say I prefer A rather than B. So I always say I'd rather open that discussion with the individual and say, look, this is why I prefer this in this scenario, and this is why I prefer this scenario. So I try and keep that dialogue very open when I'm dealing with that situation.
Excellent. Thank you, Charlie. Great to hear from you there. I just want to flag, because we have had a couple of queries in the chat, that there will be a full recording of today's event available later on. Callum, I wonder if we could come to you next to answer these questions, if that's okay with you. So, again, assumptions around your disability or condition, realities of living and working with your disability or condition, and the language that you are most comfortable using and most comfortable for other people to use. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And apologies to everybody that's on the call and is wondering why they can't see me. There is a problem with my camera on my laptop, and it's not playing ball. So I'm really sorry about that. But you can hear me, which is the most important thing. I would say the assumptions that people make about me as a blind person are that blindness is a barrier to a lot of things. So it's a barrier to things like travel. It's a barrier to things like getting a job. It's a barrier to things like doing everyday tasks that kind of, sighted people do and take for granted. So that's I think the big assumption that I have to overcome. And I would say the reality is that, excuse me, the reality is that actually blind people can do lots of things. You know, for example, if I take travel or I take work, in terms of travel, not only have I traveled within the UK, but I've traveled in South America independently, so Brazil, Argentina, and Peru. So that myth is kind of can be dispelled. And in terms of employment, I run my own business, you know, and I've worked in other jobs prior to this. I think it's fair to say that, you know, technology has evolved massively in terms of my ability as a blind person to be able to do those things. But the fact is that blindness is not the barrier that people think it is. And I think as soon as the sooner that we can all start kind of, you know, accepting that disability isn't a barrier to success, the better. In terms of language, now in the world of sight loss, I think this is one of the most complicated questions that you can get because there are so many different terms: blind, vision impaired, partially sighted, visually impaired, severely sight impaired, sight impaired. Sometimes even I don't know what the right terms are, and I have the disability. So very similar to Charlie, really. I tend to take the view that it's I try and encourage people to use the language that they are most comfortable using. So if it's vision impaired, fine. If it's blind, fine. Um, I know how I would describe myself, and I would describe myself as blind because I can't see anything. But I'm not really bothered by the language that people use as long as it's language that's comfortable to them. Because I think the more that you start saying to people, oh no, you can't say that, or you can say that, or I would avoid doing this or avoid doing that, actually the more people worry about what they do and don't say, actually the more concerned they get, and often the more uncomfortable the experiences. So I encourage people to use language that they're comfortable with, but it all depends on the context. So, you know, if they are trying to treat me in the way they would treat anybody else, fine. I don't care what language they use. If they're being negative in the way they're talking to me, then obviously, you know, that language, the way that the language they're using becomes a problem. So I think in very short summary, I would say use the language that you're comfortable with around vision impairment, but make sure it's done in the way that you would speak to anybody else.
Thank you, Callum. Excellent summary there. And then lastly, if we come over to Natasha. So Natasha, your thoughts on questions around assumptions, realities, and language, please.
So the thing that's quite interesting about the types of conditions that I have is that we use, like, a lot of people will call them chronic illnesses. Some people will call them disabilities. And even that conversation about what is a disability can get confusing for people when somebody doesn't look quote unquote disabled in a way that they might assume for what I sometimes call more traditionally understood disabilities. So when you have people with long-term health conditions that have severe pain, frequent injuries, chronic fatigue, autonomic dysfunction, and a whole lot of other conditions where you might not be able to see it. Even the conversation about what is a disability and who is disabled can be really confusing for people to understand. So I think the first assumption that people who have conditions like mine are often faced with is you're actually fine. There's nothing wrong with you in the first place because you look fine. And, you know, I can come on a panel like this, I can go out very, very rarely, or I'll do things very rarely. But those are the times that I might have planned for a week to be able to do that activity. It might take me a week to recover from that activity. And because in public, people only see you when you have kind of prepared to be in that situation more likely than not. And, you know how to put on I say I can be very charming and whatever in public. And then I come home and then I'm like shaking in bed and I can't talk. Those are things that people find really difficult to understand because of the fluctuating nature of these conditions. And likewise, these conditions often people, they can be cyclical. So you might have a period of a few months where you could do substantially more, and then you might have a period of time where you can do substantially less, and you kind of have to withdraw from the world for a bit. And I think the thing that is the most difficult is when you are kind of going without any physical representation of a disability. So the way I get treated when I need support in public, when I have a mobility aid, is significantly better than when I'm kind of like rocking up alone with just me. And it often would get to the point where like I would have to be made very ill by a situation in order for people to believe me and then give me the support that I need. And so I think the biggest assumption is if I can't see it, it doesn't exist. And likewise, it's very much the case for younger people. So you can also think about wheelchair use. If you're an ambulatory wheelchair user, if you can walk a bit, if you can walk sometimes, why do you need to use a mobility aid at other times? But these are tools that are there to support quality of life for people when they need them. And there are a lot of people with conditions who will use them as and when they need to. So for example, you know, my grandma used to be able to walk a bit, but if we needed to take her out for the day, we put her in a wheelchair and no one made any snippy comments about that, whereas they might do the same for someone like me. And with the realities of living and working with conditions like this, it makes it very hard to be able to find consistency, to be able take uh, to take energy into consideration and have things made adaptable, because I can't just show up every day. I can't show up in person. And so talking about physical accessibility is really, really important. But at the end of the day, that isn't the only thing. That you could say we have a ramp, you can come in because we've got a ramp, but it doesn't mean that the role is accessible for me. When it comes to language, I completely agree with what Charlie and Callum were saying. One thing I will say on that is a lot of people care very much about what terms you use to refer to them. And so there will be people who don't mind so much, they are more open. So it is very much about learning what terms people also prefer and what they're the most comfortable with. I don't really mind. I tend to use chronic illness and disability interchangeably. I tend to find in more official situations I use the term disability because it's actually understood better. But yeah, I completely agree with what Callum and Charlie were saying.
Thank you, Natasha. That's really insightful. And I think, you know, a few things that I just wanted to bring out following all of your answers there. Is, you know, generally on language and terminology, the advice we give is that there are generally accepted terms, and I think, you know, all of those have really been covered in your answers today, but that everybody will have their own individual personal preference, and that's okay, that's fine. I describe myself as a disabled person, and that's the terminology that I am comfortable with. I also just wanted to highlight, because Natasha's answer with your focus on kind of the idea that, you know, people can't see that I'm not okay today. And actually our last webinar session really focused on hidden disability and on the idea of that concept. So I would encourage anybody to review the recording of that webinar, and we can obviously send a link along with the follow-up materials that we send after today's session. And I also just wanted to underline the point that, you know, Natasha spoke about the idea of mobility fluctuating and some days having to use different kinds of mobility aids. And I know from experience that that's something that Charlie experiences, and that's also something that I experience. So we have days where we might use a wheelchair, we have days where we might use a walking frame, for example. So Charlie, I don't know if you've got anything to kind of pitch in there, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually you caught me out slightly because well, you can see it already. The reason I go down the route of, oh, I'm a full-time wheelchair user is because it's a lot of, for me personally, it's a lot of hassle to try and explain, oh, I sometimes use a walking frame, I sometimes use crutches, so as a blanket statement, I spend 80% of my time in a wheelchair, so I go by the term full-time wheelchair user, because I then don't have to explain what all my different mobility aids are and how many I've got hidden in my house. So that's a common thing that you've actually called me out on, is I use it as more of a blanket term to make my life easier, so I don't have to give a full explanation.
Yeah, I actually do the same thing, Charlie. It's really interesting, isn't it? That's something that we maybe haven't thought about before we brought it out in today's session.
Yeah, I think as well, actually a friend brought this out to me the other day. I think I often refer to myself as a wheelchair user rather than a rollator user or anything like that, because universally a wheelchair is more widely known and accepted a little bit more than the more obscure mobility aids that we have access to. So oftentimes I'll make, it sounds terrible to admit, but I'll make the decision to go out in my wheelchair because I will attract less attention by doing that than I would if I went out in my walking frame.
Yeah, fully agree. Natasha, feel free to jump in with any additional thoughts.
The reason I was late was because I had a new wheelchair that was being delivered, and I had to get someone to help me bring it into the building. And I went down walking with no mobility aids, walking down being like, can someone help me with my wheelchair? And even just being able to say, I can walk in my building. There are times when I have injuries when I can't. But even just that is so confusing to people. Or when I need to stop calling it this. I do walking practice because I've been building up my ability to walk over the last few years. And so when I would see people in my old building, they're like, oh, what happened? When I would be in the wheelchair, they're like, oh, you're better now. It's like, no. And it was always, people seem to I don't mind because people are kind of genuinely curious. I've tried to care less. But it can be really difficult because it comes down to that idea of belief. Of it's like, why do you need to have this thing if I can see you literally standing here in front of me right now? And it's a very emotionally charged thing. So when we're thinking about airports or we're thinking about hospitals that are really, really big, I live very close to a hospital that is an absolute nightmare to get into and to walk around, and everything is so spread apart. So going to a clinic where I could walk in, there's a thing, I could walk in and do that. Whereas in some hospitals, I would need to use a wheelchair because it is too much because of pain and fatigue. And so it's those types of things when you walk into a museum and you walk up to the desk and say, hi, can I rent a wheelchair while I'm here? And they look you up and down. And so it's a very interesting kind of place to be in with these like fluctuations. And as you said, often for people, it might be easier to just say I use a wheelchair all the time, because then you're not having to deal with that belief and that questioning side of things.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. It's actually I'm learning as well, and yeah, that is my own experience because I do describe myself as a wheelchair user, but actually I only really use a wheelchair outside of the house. It's a very interesting thing, isn't it? Charlie, we'll come back to you for a final point and then we'll move on to our next set of questions, if that's okay.
It was just a finishing point on the term, on the thing of like, oh, it being easier and not having to explain. I think it really, one thing to consider is it really depends on the individual on that day, like anyone does. We have up and down days, and it might be a day where, look, I just can't be bothered to answer a million questions about my disability. On another day, I might be like, yeah, let's have the chat and let's sit down. So it's about being aware of, it might just be that person's having a bad day and that's why they don't want to do a full discussion surrounding their condition. So it's just something to be mindful of.
Absolutely, 100%. Thank you, Charlie. Really insightful. Just a couple of things to bring out from the comments before we move on to our next slide. So we have a comment from Freya who tells us that she's really happy and excited to see Natasha here today, because she's an avid listener of your podcast and it's really helped her to deal with her condition.
Thank you.
And then we also have a comment from Daniel, who says that he's noticed that chronic illness as a term doesn't trigger the response that someone may need, whereas in official situations, disability as a term can work better because there are generally policies set up for disability.
Can I just very quickly say something on that? Like that was literally why I started using the term disabled. And there's a conversation to be had about why people with very disabling chronic illnesses don't feel like they can call themselves disabled. That's for another thing. But a lot of people will start using the term disabled so that they can access care and support within these more structured environments.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm thinking a whole other webinar session on chronic illness versus disability and the intersection there. Anyway, conscious of time, I would like to move us along to our next questions, please. So this really focuses on the experiences that you guys have had. And we would like to know a time where you came up against barriers to accessibility. And we want you to think about those three facets that we brought out in the introduction. So pre-arrival accessibility information, the welcome and service received, and accessibility of the physical space. Callum, are you happy to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I was going to jump in, so that was great.
Perfect.
That's good. We're on the same page. Yeah, so I would say I'd say as a starting point, I'm fortunate in that I don't have too many negative access experiences, but when they come or when they happen, you definitely remember them. So for me, one that I always think of is actually quite a recent one. I was trying to go to a concert, and the first thing to say was that buying a ticket on the website was impossible because the website had been so badly designed that even somebody using a screen reader like me just couldn't actually use it. I managed to do it in the end, but it took me 3 or 4 attempts to actually make it work. So that was the first thing. But obviously, the other thing that I look for on a website or in terms of pre-arrival information is, okay, I can get to the venue. I need a train or a taxi. I can do all of those things. But when I get there, like, who's going to guide me from A to B? How am I going to get to my seat? How am I going to find all that stuff? And whilst there was a lot of access information on the website of the particular concert venue, actually the one piece of information that I really needed to know as a blind person, which was, do you offer sighted guide and how do I organize that, just wasn't there at all. And when I questioned the venue, they didn't know themselves whether they offered it or not, which I think is really quite worrying. It's something you should either know whether you do that or not. In terms of the experience itself, in terms of the welcome when I got there, I would say people were friendly, but they didn't know what to do, and they were obviously very nervous and very uncomfortable. And actually, in some ways, that makes the experience worse, and it makes the experience harder because not only are you trying to, do the thing that you're supposed to be doing, i.e., go to a seat, you're actually trying to manage the emotions and the tension of the person or people that you're you're trying to get the support from. And I think, I think it's a very important thing to say, but disabled people are at the end of the day people, and therefore we need to be treated as people. And it just felt like I was being um, treated sort of differently in that sense. In terms of the physical space, yeah, I mean, this is obviously not so relevant to a blind person because the one thing I can say about being blind is my legs and arms work fine. So, walking around isn't something. The actual physical moving around isn't my issue. It's knowing where I'm moving. But I would say that there were things like, it's good practice that you have tactile markings to indicate when flights of stairs start and finish, and the venue didn't have that. So that was definitely one thing I noticed that could have been improved. But in terms of, I'd say, as I say, physical access is not the most important consideration for a blind person. It's important, but it's not the most important. It's definitely the access of the online infrastructure and the online information, and frankly as well the attitude of the people at the venue that you're going to that are the most important things. So that's my experience.
Thanks, Callum. Great to hear there. And I think just to bring out what you said there is that disabled people are people. We are customers just like everybody else, and we want to be treated like customers just like everybody else. And what we don't want is necessarily to have to feel like we're spending all of our time educating people when, as you say, we should be enjoying the experience. So I would like to pass on to another panelist. Charlie, are you happy to jump in here with some thoughts?
Yeah, no worries. I think from my lived experience, I've had ups, downs. I had some really good ones and really bad ones. One of the ones that we could have spun around very easily was one I had very recently at a restaurant in London. The venue knew I was a wheelchair user, knew I needed additional requirements, and then once I arrived, the first sentence that came out of their mouth was, "By the way, the disabled toilet's not working." Now, as someone who's just obviously gone to go out to dinner, that sent a shiver of fear down my spine, because I went, right, what's the game plan now? And it was that whole initial thought of, well, they knew I was a wheelchair user. Why didn't they phone me before I arrived in London, which is an hour journey for me? So that was my first thought, was, why has there been no pre-consideration of, oh, this has an impact on one of our customers. Let's make sure that he's as comfortable as possible. But then it turned out that they managed to get a disabled toilet working on the next floor, and that worked well. But then additionally to that, they made it fast coded. So I was constantly having to ask members of staff to open the door for me, whereas I would be fully able to open the door, but they wouldn't give out that information. So that experience was one of those times where it could have very easily been turned from a very negative experience of, oh no, I'm going to have to go home, to, oh no, like, we've managed to find a solution, let's make you as comfortable as possible. So that's one of the experiences where it's a bit of an in-between. In terms of actually giving you some insight into pre-arrival information, for me, I'm a bit of a serial planner. So whenever I go anywhere, I've researched it to the nth degree. And I think that's a common thing for any disabled person of, we have to. We can't. We'd love to be impulse, but we can't, because we don't have that opportunity to just go, yeah, that's fine, we can go to that place because we know it's accessible. We have to do so much research. For me, so with that comes a lot of anxiety, because I sit there going, is the information provided correct? Is it going to be as it's explained on the website? Is it going to be in a slightly different location? Have I found the right address? Things like that. So it's constantly having to think of those situations. So for me, as I mentioned earlier, my main things are, is there going to be level access? Is there going to be a parking space if I'm driving? And is there going to be an accessible toilet? And all this information can be really easy to find, or can be really difficult to find. But then with that comes a lot of social anxieties. And that's what I wanted to really bring to the plate today, of, there's a lot of stress involved for many disabled people before they've even entered an area, whether that be a job interview, whether that be going to a restaurant, whether that be going to a hospital appointment. All of that involves a lot of social anxieties, and how draining that can be is huge. I mean, to give you a better example, I think this might hit home of, imagine going to a job interview, and before you even got there, you're stressed because you're like, and this actually happened to me. I couldn't find a parking space. I was running late. I was going to be late for my interview. I was worried that was going to impact one of the very few interviews I was able to get, because it's hard to find accessible workplaces. So then that all intangible into one makes it very challenging for a disabled individual. And I know I've gone around about this in a strange way, but I'm trying to explain that there are so many facets that we as disabled people have to consider, and it's just about managing that. As well, as someone who's working at a premises, you might be able to just ease some of that anxiety by being a little bit more aware of it. And in terms of physical space, for me as a wheelchair user, that's another big issue of, is there going to be enough space for me to get through the door? Is the door width wide enough? Is there enough space between things like tables and things like that? Or one of the common ones that I get is, oh, we haven't got a disabled toilet, but we got a big enough toilet. Will you be able to manage? Now, that's a really hard question to answer, because I've never been to that location. I don't know whether it's got a sink in the right place that I can replace that from a grab rail. So it's making that information as clear to the disabled individual as possible. So oftentimes when I'm looking at places to visit, I often say, can I have photographs? Because in my head then I can go, okay, this is what it looks like. I can see, I can grab hold of this, I can do this, we could move this. So that's another thing, is when you're considering advising someone with a disability, if you can provide them physical evidence such as pictures or videos, that helps ease a lot of anxieties as well. So that's another piece maybe to take away from today. But it is, I think that, I say, the one thing I want to highlight is the level of anxiety that can be caused by a negative experience or not having this information readily available.
Thank you, Charlie. We will go into further detail on this later on in the session, but I just wanted to bring out of Charlie's answer there. You know, Charlie needs detailed information. Charlie needs photographs. Charlie needs to know before he goes what's available. So ultimately, Charlie needs an accessible access guide to all of the venues that he visits before he goes, to get rid of any arrival anxiety.
Yep.
And we will talk a little bit further about that a little bit later on. So Natasha, I'd just like to get your thoughts on this question, please. I think we've probably got about 4 minutes to cover this, so I don't want to rush you, but I'm hoping that we can get a nice concise answer out in that time.
I'll very
Thank
quickly
you.
talk about two half things, because I think they cover two sides of different situations. One of them, so you can book these events that youngish people go to in general, where they don't tell you the location of the event until the day. I often found that also, in order to be able to sit down or have somewhere quiet to go, which is extremely important for me, I would need to buy the VIP tickets, which meant I'm spending double the price for two people to be able to have access to somewhere quieter, and I'm not going to be somewhere where I can get knocked into, which is extremely dangerous for me. I have had several occasions where I'd email them in advance saying, I really want to come. I will sign an NDA. I will not tell anyone where this is. I just need to know how far away it is from my house and whether I can actually get there. Even if they tell you where the tube is, they don't tell you how far the walk is from the tube station. They kind of take you to there, which means as an event, this is completely impossible for me to get there on my own, being able to plan in advance and know whether I'd be able to attend based on how far and how difficult the accessibility journey will be for me to get there, which has meant I stopped going to events that I found really, really enjoyable. So I didn't even get in the room. I stopped even being able to get in the room because I didn't have the basic information of where it is. And even though I kept saying, like, I'm happy to sign something if it's that much of a big deal, yeah, so that has been the case with like quite a few things, where they're kind of on the more cool side. In terms of barriers in real life, again, the issue can be something like airports. So I now, when I go out in public for longer periods of time, when I travel, I use a wheelchair. I can't manage without a wheelchair now. Before, I could get from being dropped off to the assistants, and my dad would come in with me, bring my suitcase. And I'd go to the assistant's desk, and I had an experience where I was traveling alone to meet my boyfriend in Germany. And they said to me, "Oh, we're too busy. Go and drop off the suitcase yourself. Go through security yourself. Like queue up and stand." I was like, I literally cannot do that. And they looked at me. They're like, "Well, you walked up here," and it was extremely disheartening and extremely frustrating to have to kind of argue with them for assistance that I had pre-booked. Assistance at airports has got worse because the drain on the services has got the pressure on the services has got significantly worse. So I was stuck in a room for best part of 3 hours. I couldn't go to the loo beforehand because I would have missed my flight. And often I find that a lot of the like the chairs at airports are chairs. Even I find like doctors' waiting room chairs. Often I'm very short, so that probably doesn't help. They're extremely uncomfortable and they can trigger things like sciatica. You can end up being in more pain using things that you're forced to use. But I definitely have found that, showing up because I had walked across one room, even though I had pre-booked saying that I need support from a wheelchair at the airport, they were like, well, you don't really need this. We will come and meet you after security. And actually getting through security is one of the more difficult bits. So for a lot of people, being in very crowded environments, whether that's sensorially or physically dangerous for them, that can be really quite a challenge. And I know airports in a lot of places now are very keen on the sunflower lanyards. Personally, I hate them. Maybe a controversial point. I don't feel like I should have to wear something fluorescent to be able to have people who should be trained to offer to support to people offer support. Part of it is aesthetic, don't want to wear a lanyard, but part of it is also I don't feel like I should have to wear that specifically for me to go up to a trained individual and say I have booked this in advance, and if I'm not wearing a lanyard, they're not going to take that as seriously. So yeah, I hope that was within the 4 minutes.
We're all good. We're all good. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you. And I think that just makes me want to sort of bring out one of the comments that we have had in the chat here, which is, you know, very important not to expect disabled people to explain their full medical history in order to have access. I think we can all agree on that, you know, none of us feel like we should be giving full detail of our conditions to strangers so that we can have basic access. We have had quite a few more comments, etc., coming through, so I am going to try my best to bring them out as we get to the most appropriate points for them, and as I say, we will also have the Q&A at the end. So moving on to the next slide, I'd like to ask all of our panelists, so the experiences that you just talked to us about, you have already kind of mentioned if or when they had a positive outcome, but you know, please can we kind of underline, did any of those experiences have a positive outcome? If not, how could they have had a positive outcome? Could your needs have been better understood? Could the physical space be more accessible? And how important is having detailed, accurate and up-to-date accessibility information for you? I mentioned before that we will be bringing out the idea of you know, AccessAble's access guides as a solution to a lot of this pre-arrival anxiety issue. So if there is anything, panelists, within that slide that you feel that you haven't covered in your previous answers, feel free to bring it out now. We will continue in the order that we have been. So Callum, if we could come to you first.
So I would say, in my experience, was there a positive outcome? Well, depends what you mean by a positive outcome. So yes, there was a positive outcome in the sense that the venue, you know, did acknowledge or accept that there were things that they could have done better, and obviously, you know, did apologize for it not being the experience that I would have wanted and hoped it to be. But I didn't really, but I don't really know whether they're just saying it because it's the right thing to do, and I don't really know whether they actually have any intentions of really addressing the issues that I faced. So I think how you make that experience more positive, or how you make sure that that is a negative more positive, is be very clear about what it is that you're going to do. So is it that you know, you're going to review what happened and you're going to come back to the person, you're going to undertake to come back to that individual within a time period with your kind of outcomes or the conclusions that you've drawn? You know, is it that you accept it's gone wrong, and if so, what are you going to do? Don't just say, oh, you know, we're going to look at what we can do to address it. No, I want to know what it is that you're going to do, right? That's really important to me. But I would also finish by saying, actually, if that person's made a complaint about an experience they've had, as much as they are complaining about a problem that you're causing, you know, we as disabled people can be part of the solution to your problem. So you know, if that venue, if that a really perhaps positive outcome, bear in mind I run a consultancy, would have been for that venue to say, hey, look, I see you run a consultancy, and obviously they know I run a consultancy because I flag it up to them. We'd actually really like to work with you to address these issues. So and that to me is really important, because, you know, you're never going to get it right unless you take on board the views of disabled people, because fundamentally human beings are creatures of habit, and we make decisions and judgments based on what we know and what we understand. So if you don't have a disability, you're not going to think about it in that way, or in the way that you otherwise might have done, because you don't have that lived experience of it. So work with us work with us as part of your solution, and I guarantee you, if you do that, you'll end up with a much more positive outcome otherwise. So that's what I would say on that question.
Thank you, Callum. I think really, that's the reason why we're all here today, isn't it? We're all here today to learn from the lived experiences of disabled people as our panelists. And, we are very fortunate at AccessAble to be able to work with Callum and Charlie and Natasha and a host of other ambassadors with lived experience of disability, which really inform what we do. So I would like to then pass this on to Charlie. Anything from this slide that you feel you haven't covered in your previous answer around more positive outcomes?
No, as I said, eventually my experience did get turned into a positive. There was definitely more they could have done in terms of making that experience more independent for me, as opposed to being reliant on the staff. But just as I say, completely agree with Callum's point of you use disabled people to really build your understanding and build your systems so that they really do truly work. Don't just guess at it. Use us to your advantage and use our lived experiences to make your businesses and your places better and have better systems in place.
Thank you, Charlie. And then we'll come to Natasha last on this one, please. So,
not on my specific things that I mentioned, but I did have an experience that was very positive where I couldn't access somewhere because it wasn't wheelchair accessible. I spoke to one of the heads of the company, and it was a huge chains across the country, and they did an audit off the back of our conversation, got ramps for dozens and dozens of their locations. And I had recommended some other things for them to do as well. A year later, I tried to go to one of their locations and they couldn't find the ramp. And so I spoke to them again, and we were just talking about consultancy bringing people in. They wanted to give me a meal in exchange for me to do free consultancy for them. And I had already given them a huge amount of information. And I think it's very important to talk to your customers, to your clients, to understand what they need. But if you actually want a full consultancy job done, you need to hire people to do that professionally. You shouldn't be relying on somebody emailing you coming off of the street and then planning your entire thing around what one person is saying. And likewise, disabled people deserve to be paid for their time and expertise. A lot of us work in this field specifically. And so spending significant amounts of time trying to make a for-profit business better while not being compensated, you wouldn't really expect that of anywhere else, or in many other situations. So fan of consultancy. So just echoing what was said before.
fully agree on that. Thank you, Natasha. It would be remiss of me not to point out, as this is an AccessAble event, that AccessAble do offer a full service consultancy option for businesses and all of our clients. So we can help with a variety of different consultancies, and indeed a lot of it is informed by our work and lived experience of our ambassadors. And I think I just want to underline this last point, detailed, accurate and up-to-date accessibility information. If we think about all of the experiences that our panelists have talked to us about so far today, and we think about expectation management, and we think about arrival anxiety, and I think that all of those things can be solved by businesses just clearly and concisely stating what accessibility is available. And obviously that's what we're here to do at AccessAble. We're here to work with businesses and organisations to come out, survey your venue, to create detailed accessibility information, ultimately detailed accessibility information that is factual, non-judgmental, all of that kind of thing. And I said this in an interview recently, is that I understand that ultimately not everywhere can be accessible. to me as a wheelchair user. But I do believe that everywhere can tell me what they have available or what they don't have available. And ultimately then that's my choice. The decision is in my hands. So I would like to move on to our last question for panelists. And then we will go on to audience Q&A, and I will read out some of the bits and pieces that have come across through the chat. So flipping it around, we'd like to know about your most positive accessibility experience. We'd like to know what made it positive, how the experience impacted you personally, and how you think organisations could learn from this to serve disabled people better. And I do just want to underline that we have a cross section of organisations within the audience. So we have multiple different sectors: healthcare, private sector, education, and some local authority as well. So if you could try and sort of tailor your answer in terms of how organisations can learn from it to different settings, that would be much appreciated. And I suggest we'll continue in the same order that we have been. So Callum, I'll come to you first.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, one positive, really positive experience that I can think of, and I think can be applied to almost anybody on this call, really, is I had, and not so much the event itself, but the learnings from it, I think are really important. So I was invited a few months ago to a reception up in London. Now, receptions for a blind person are really, really tricky events to go to because there's a lot going on. There's a lot of people are moving around. You're expected to mingle, and it's really difficult to know where stuff is when you can't see where it is. So they are really, really tricky events to get right or to enjoy, unless the right support's in place. Now, first thing I wanted to draw out from this is that in the invitation, it actually said in the invitation, if you have any access requirements or we need to make any reasonable adjustments, I can't remember the precise wording, but it was definitely something along those lines, please let us know when you RSVP. Now, I cannot tell you how important this is because there are disabled people out there who will choose not to disclose because they're worried about how you, as a non-disabled person, are going to respond to that answer. They are really worried about that, so they often they can choose not to. So by having a statement in an invitation like that, it means that you're it's very encouraging, and people are far more likely to disclose and have those conversations going forward. And actually, that statement was repeated in all the comms leading up to the event, right? So there were ample opportunities. So I disclose and I say what my disability is, and the organisation in question call me up and talk through what those adjustments might look like. And they arranged for me to have a guide for the entirety of the reception. So when I arrived at the tube station nearest to the venue, the guide was waiting. The guide took me to the venue. The guide stayed with me throughout the reception, throughout the whole time, helping me move around, helping me talk to people, find people that I wanted to see. And then crucially, got me back to a train station or tube station afterwards. And I cannot tell you in terms of kind of how it made me feel, like that's probably the most relaxed I've been going to an event of that sort because I knew exactly what I was going to get. I knew exactly what I needed to do in order to get it. And actually, I could enjoy the event in the same way that anybody else would, um, just just with the right adjustments and the right support in place. So that would be, I think, a really good example of a positive access experience in that situation. And it's often one that I talk about when I'm talking to organizations and giving them examples of the kind of thing they should be trying to achieve.
Excellent. Thank you, Callum. It's really good to hear of some real kind of best practice there. And I think, you know, the main thing that strikes me from your answer there is that none of that is complicated. None of it is complex. It's actually quite straightforward. And ultimately, it is leaving the power, as it were, in your hands. You know, it's up to you to describe your requirements, and you know the services that you need have been made available for you. It's just it's sort of up to you to let them know what's needed, and I think that's the right way. So Charlie, can we have some thoughts from you on positive accessibility experiences, how it's impacted you, and how organisations could learn from it to serve disabled people better?
Yep, and I think again, Callum came up with a very good example in terms of it is all about just opening that conversation with the disabled individual and just opening the door for us to be able to discuss what we might need, but giving us the opportunities so we don't have to, we're not constantly coming to you. So it's nice to have that feeling of, okay, we want to serve you, let me know how we can help you. So it's opening that dialect of we almost the company or organization coming to you first, and that's what I'd like to bring is that is what we should be getting to. It shouldn't have to be disabled people doing most of the legwork. And to come to my positive experiences, it comes from that of having that dialect open in terms of being a young disabled person. Oftentimes it can feel as if you do need support, that the support is constantly on top of you. They need to be there, they need to be holding your hand, and it's getting, for me personally, it's getting away from that. And the very positive experience I had, the two that I'm going to describe for you now, is one was at a music festival. Now obviously this isn't going to work for everyone, but it's just opening that. It basically, what they did was, I got to the event, the guy introduced himself, asked what I might need, if there was any concerns that I had, where things were, if I needed any support, or if I was happy to be supported by my friends and for them to take a bit more of a back seat. And that's something I would want to highlight for all businesses, because that's an area where everyone can take something away of, have that dialect open so that you can, if the person does need a higher level of support and does need a bit more direct support, it can be there, but there is also the opportunity for the individual for the support individual to take a step back and go, we're here if you need us. Because that's one of my things, is I don't like it when people are right on top of me, because then it ruins the atmosphere with the people you're with, because you constantly feel isolated. So that's something I would say, is just make sure that you're in constant contact with the disabled individual as to how they would like to see the support. And it's about being flexible. So when building your processes, I would say try and be as flexible as possible. And then the other thing I would like to highlight as well is try and make your accessibility experiences part of your normal processes. So it doesn't have to be, oh, because Charlie's in a wheelchair, he goes over to the disability support team. It should just be your staff are aware and it's part of their processes. So you're not isolating the disabled individual. And the second experience I'm just going to briefly touch on is an experience of that. I went to a restaurant and the server naturally was very, very open to helping everyone, but was very aware of that my partner was constantly helping me. So he wanted to take that stress away and give the opportunity for her to relax and enjoy the experience and not be supporting me at all times. It was really nice to experience that, because no one really offers that. No one goes, oh, let me support this person so then everyone involved can enjoy the experience. But for me as an individual, it didn't feel as if I was being supported as a disabled individual. It felt just part of the experience. And that's what we need to get to, is it all being part of the experience as opposed to going to the disability team or going to the access team. It's getting away from that separation.
Thank you, Charlie. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. You know, the idea that, and I say this a lot in presentations and things, that good customer service is good customer service. regardless of the ability or disability of your customer. Natasha, I'll hand over to you for thoughts on positive experiences, the impact that they had on you, and how you think organisations could learn from them. Thank you.
I'll mostly piggyback off what has been said, but the best access experience I've ever had was at Disneyland. It was so easy to get around, to do everything. It was great. What I wanted to talk about more, just piggybacking off of what had been said, is I think I agree it's extremely important to not put everything on the disabled person, having that information there, but also not making people have to phone up or sit on things, like being able to have things available online where they don't have to call a special number, where they have one person dealing with everything. So if you think about something like booking theatre tickets, in a lot of places, I don't have access to the same booking things as other people, and I have spent up to an hour at a time trying to book a ticket for a show where everyone else can just book it on the internet. And having those different kinds of options available. So also just not assuming that all disabled people, for example, as has been said, will need a wheelchair. So when I don't have a mobility aid, I might need to be in a certain area, but it doesn't mean that I need to take up a wheelchair space at that time. And so often there's very limited information or very limited options. But a huge thing, like the amount of time I have wasted having to stay on hold, just trying to book something that I could have literally done in 2.5 minutes, if I could have done it online. And so just thinking about ways in which people who have those access needs can be communicated. So for me, people don't need my medical history to know what my access needs are. I can just kind of tick off a few boxes and send that off. And if there is more information where I would need to go into that, then I could do that. But a lot of times just being able to like now when I fly, everything is just already on my account. I don't have to think about that as any extra type of thing. And that's a huge kind of time and stress saver for me. Because sometimes, especially actually, the other thing that I will say, and I know this is a huge structural issue, so I'm not saying there is an easy solution to this. There's often the assumption that we don't do things last minute. So often places will say we need 1 week's notice, or we need 48 hours notice, or we need 24 hours notice in order for you to have that support. What happens if I suddenly have decided to go out, or I need to do something, and I have not been able to give them that information in advance? It might not be guaranteed that I can have the support that is needed for me to be able to be there in the first place. And so I do not have the solution to this. I'm sure there are people who have got some solutions to this, but how can you start also thinking about the fact that people have spontaneous lives, and might not necessarily be able to tell you a full week in advance what their plans are in order to get that kind of support.
Thank you, Natasha. I think some really interesting answers to that question. I think, ultimately a lot of people just feeling on the same page, really, which is, my takeaway from that is that, as disabled people, we want to be treated as customers. We want to be treated as valued customers. We want to feel that our spend is valued and that our customer is valued. We don't always want to feel like we have to use a kind of a segregated service to get the assistance or the accessibility that we need. We absolutely do need that pre-arrival information so we can understand how accessible things are before we arrive, and so that we can make the informed choice about whether a venue is accessible for us or not. I do really want to underline that. I think we can all be in agreement that we don't want anybody to tell us whether or not their venue is suitable for us, because that should be our choice. Actually, we just want the information provided so that we can make that decision. Thank you, everybody. I think we've had some really rich and varied experiences shared through there. So I am now going to move on to our Q&A session. And before we jump into questions from the audience, I am just going to bring out a few bits and pieces that we've had in the chat throughout the session. A really active discussion, which is great to see. But I will say to our audience members, if you do have a question that you'd like to answer, please feel free to use the raise hand function, unmute your microphone, and ask you, and we'll get ready for you to ask your question. So one of the queries that we have had is from Thornton Hall Country Park, who are a visitor attraction working to improve accessibility, provide as much detail as possible in their accessibility information. Do we know any venues that do this very well? Where have we encountered great experiences? And what can the attraction learn from them? So I will jump in first of all here and say that, you know, we are AccessAble. We are the UK's leading provider of detailed disabled access information. We'd absolutely love to have a chat to you about how we might be able to help you to improve accessibility and to improve your accessibility information. If any of the panelists have any thoughts on that, any thoughts on visitor attractions that they feel have done things really well, do feel free to jump in. No, we're all good there, we're all good. Okay, so I can see that we have a hand raised from Freya. So Freya, please feel free to unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. So I'm Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Social Work England. I also have chronic fatigue syndrome and ADHD, which I both see both as invisible disabilities. My role and my sort of personal investment in it, obviously, is trying to raise awareness to people in my organisation about what they can do to support accessibility. As just one of the things that I do. Obviously, we need to raise awareness about all sorts of different issues affecting protected characteristics and that kind of thing. But the thing that we find the most difficult is that we see the same names in the organisation attending all the same training events, volunteering for things. And we realise it's really the people that don't sign up for everything, that we don't see the names of, that probably need the information more than anyone else. I just wondered if, pardon me, excuse me, I've been talking all day with my voice going. If anyone had any kind of insight into how we can potentially target people who maybe aren't as open and eager to get invested in accessibility. I know that's a really broad question, so yeah, anything anyone can provide would be helpful.
Definitely a big question there, but Charlie's gone straight in with his hand up, so I'm going to hand over to Charlie for his thoughts.
It's a very broad answer, but a interviewee that I had on my podcast raised it a little while ago. It's worth highlighting to many people that, particularly when it comes to physical disability, she said people are more likely to end up in our situation than the disabled people are in their situation. So it's about highlighting, okay, this information might not impact you now, but you might have an opportunity later in life where that information does become beneficial, and that may be an avenue that you could explore, saying, look, this might not affect you now, but it may affect you later in life. So it's a very broad way of tackling it, and it may not work for your organization, but it's maybe a food for thought thing that you might be able to thread into some of your processes.
That's so helpful. Yeah, that's really good insight. Thank you. I think, some people do refer to non-disabled or able-bodied people as pre-disabled, as we all, hopefully end up in old age eventually, and we'll start to experience some of these access issues or mobility or whatever it may be, loss of sight or hearing or anything. So yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
No worries.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Freya. Natasha, I think you've got your hand up. Some thoughts for Freya here. Thank you.
I also think that, oh my gosh, my brain just went completely blank. Sorry. But I think there's two sides to this. There's often by being able to better understand like our service users or the people that we're there to support, it's really important if we care about doing our jobs well and we care about supporting people, kind of framing it in that sense, like you'll be able to better support the people that you're trying to support by paying attention to this. But also, it feels really cynical to say it this way, there's a really significant business case for understanding accessibility. Disabled people have a huge amount of spending power that is often not considered because they're not even able to get the support to be in the room. So obviously for social care that's slightly different, but just in terms of thinking how can you support your service users, and then for people who are, you know, in more for-profit businesses, disabled people are potential customers that you're losing out on, and so for people who work in those kinds of industries that might have a bit of an aversion to thinking about that could be another way to talk to them about it.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And again, I love your podcast. Thank you for doing everything that you do. You're amazing.
Thank you. Or
Thank
maybe
you,
Jay.
Freya. It's I getting a bit of accessibility love here. We love to see it, don't we? Amazing. Okay. Any other questions from anybody in our audience? Feel free to use the raise hand function to ask your question. I will also just have a little look into the chat and see if we've got anything that we can bring out here. We've got a question from Richard. So Richard, feel free to unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Thank you, Carrie-Anne. I hope this isn't too specific a question, but I work for a tourist organisation, and unsurprisingly, very often people come in groups. If somebody with a disability is in that group, it may be very difficult to accommodate their needs at the same time as accommodating everybody else's needs. There seem to be two options. One is obviously to adjust the way the tour is presented to suit one or other party or somewhere in between, or to offer something separate for the person who has particular needs. And I just wondered, with people who have disabilities on your panel, which of those they would prefer, because I know very often my own experience is that people with disabilities do not necessarily like to be treated differently, but in that particular situation it may be very difficult and give them a less good experience if they're not treated differently. I just wondered what the feeling was on that from people.
Carrie-Anne, can I take this? I'll start off and then
Absolutely, yeah.
I'll
We'll do
start off
Callum first, and then we'll go over to Charlie.
Then
Thank you.
obviously Charlie, feel free to come in. I think you raise a really important question, and as somebody who you know, has travelled, I travelled a lot around South America, and had to have tour guides in every place that I was in. So I think the first thing I would say is, and it's a very obvious starting point, but I think it's worth saying, it really depends on the disability that you're dealing with. And so I think that there isn't such a thing as a one size fits all solution. I think it really has to be weighed up based on the disability that you're dealing with and the needs that that person presents. I absolutely take the point that you know, some disabled people really would not like to be in a group setting, or sorry, in a private setting, because you know, they want to be with everybody else, and that's really important to them. I actually, as a blind person, I actually don't mind being in a private setting, because it means that my needs can be tailored to, can be fully catered for. So it might be that, you know, I want to touch things, and obviously, and it's going to take me longer to explore a particular object or artifact or item, and you know, that might be quite difficult to carry out when you're on a group tour. So that's one thing. But I think, you know, but there will be disabilities where you know, a group tour is is okay and it's accessible. I think the really important thing, though, is that your team and your staff are trained properly so that they feel comfortable in administering those tours, regardless of the needs of that individual. I remember, for example, being in Buenos Aires, and my guide was told only on the day I was arriving that I was blind. She had no experience, didn't know what to do, and actually felt very, very scared and very let down. And that had a really profound impact, and then a profound impact in a negative way on the experience I had there, because she didn't want to be there. She'd given up. So I'm sorry that's quite a long answer, but I hope it's helpful in some way. Charlie, do you want to take over?
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered it. But one thing I would say, as Carrie said several times, is always just put the power in the disabled person's hands, in terms of let them make the decision, because it's a very individual answer, especially because I've experienced both, and you can get enjoyment from both sides. So it isn't necessarily that I would say, oh, I prefer one over the other. It just depends on the event that we're going to, or the thing that we're doing, as to what option works best for me. So it's just about putting the power back in the disabled person's hands.
Incredible. Thanks, Charlie. And I do agree with that. I think, it's a personal preference thing, but it also depends on the context of the situation. So I would always want to be given the option. And then I'm just going to pass over to Natasha, because I think she's got some final thoughts to share on this question.
Very quickly, I did my first private accessible tour on my honeymoon, and we spent a significant premium. It was maybe 40 or 50% more than other private tours we had seen, because it was labeled as an accessible tour. It felt like a glorified taxi service. The guide didn't really give us any guiding, and it more felt like we were paying a huge amount for an accessible vehicle, a driver, and the tour guide to take us to and from locations. And so I think it's also really important to remember that a lot of disabled people are in situations where they have to pay a premium for services in order for them to be accessible. And often there can be the case where those services are then subpar, or it's very difficult to deal with when you're having to spend so much more money in order to have an experience that is accessible to you, while that and not have that experience be excellent. So I think it's always really worth being mindful of the amount of money that disabled people have to pay just to be able to access things in a way that other people would. So I could have done a free tour, for example, a free walking tour, as opposed to having spent a small fortune on something that was like, I was very angry about it for about 2 weeks afterwards because of how much it cost. So I think that's also really worth keeping in mind, that not only are you offering an accessible service or working towards offering an accessible service, it should also be as high quality as any other service that you offer to non-disabled people.
Very important point. Thank you, Natasha. I have time for one more very quick question. I can see somebody with their hand raised here. Anne, you've got your hand raised. Anne, please feel free to unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Just a brief one. I might have missed it, but I don't think you mentioned people who are deaf. Did you mention it at all? Which is obviously another disability.
Indeed, yeah. So we don't have anybody on today's panel representing hearing loss, although we do have several members of our ambassador network that do represent hearing loss. So if there is a question that you'd like to ask to somebody who has lived experience of that, I'm going to leave my contact details on the next slide. Feel free to reach out to me directly, and I can field that for you.
My stepson's profoundly deaf, so I'm aware of the problems that he faces on a daily basis. And I was just curious that you hadn't covered the needs of the deaf, but maybe it's because, well, I thought that there was probably some way they could have interacted with, but anyway, I understand.
No problem. Thank you. Okay, I think, yes, we've probably got time for one more very quick question if anybody has one to ask. Otherwise, I will move on to close. I can't see any raised hands, so we will move on. to closing remarks. So I just want to thank all of our participants for sharing their really valuable thoughts and experiences. We hope that the session today has given you some insight into the accessibility challenges that disabled people face and how they can ultimately lead to positive improvements. We'll be emailing everybody who's attended today with a recording of the session. Feel free to share that with any colleagues or networks who you think may benefit from it. We will also share the slides from the session, and we'll share a short feedback form. We'd be really grateful if you could all complete the form. The feedback is really important in helping us to plan future webinar sessions. Thank you for joining us today. I will leave my contact details here on the last slide, so feel free to grab my contact details from there. If you have any feedback, questions, comments, any further questions that you might like to put to our panelists today, I can connect you with them directly. And yeah, anything that you'd like to let us know, or indeed anything that AccessAble might be able to support you with that might have come to mind after today's session. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you've all found it beneficial. And we will look forward to seeing you all again at our next AccessAble webinar.